Hello and welcome to this video. A few months ago I filmed a video called Why Does All Modern Jazz Sound the Same? Which was a bit of a extreme title for a video. I didn't agree with it at the time, but it was a comment that someone had put up on my channel and I tried to discuss it. That video is now the most viewed video on this channel, and I think because although many people have argued against this, there must be something about the contemporary jazz scene which is making many people look and agree. Loads more people came in saying they agreed. Now that doesn't mean it's true, of course. So I have been on an excursion since then exploring this idea, and I've talked to many people on here about it. As time has got on, I have come to certain conclusions. And it's not what I thought the conclusions would be. I think I've spotted what my problem is with it. I think what's happened is that jazz has moved from being an in-the-moment, improvised, countercultural, representing the underclasses, representing the underprivileged, giving a voice to them style of music. It was dangerous, and now more than any other art form it's become the music of the elite. It's become the music of the sort of educated, sophisticated, erudite class. Okay, now you could just say that, well, that's because the art form, that happens to all art forms. And I think it has to a certain extent, but if we look at the history of jazz over the last 40 years, and I knew that I had a blind spot here, that I didn't know this history so well. And if you look at a lot of the modern jazz groups that are out right now, they aren't ploughing the same sort of stuff that the Young Lions, Winton and all those guys were in the 80s. There's all sorts of exciting, free improvisation and fusion going on. There's all this sort of stuff, and people have pointed to that. But when I listen to it, it's lacking something, and I've tried to argue what it is. And what I think it is, it's lacking the danger. It's lacking the in-the-momentness, the rawness. All right? I'm going to, on this video, try and explain why I think this is. So, in 1993, Bill Clinton made a speech. He was talking at the 40th anniversary of the Newport Jazz Festival. And in that speech, he described jazz as being America's classical music. I have probably said this on this channel without really thinking. Jazz is a very serious, sophisticated style of music, and it is equivalent and like classical music, right? I started to think about where that idea came from and did a little bit of searching, and I came across this speech by Bill Clinton. So there we have the President of America, the saxophone playing President of America, describing jazz as classical music. And I thought, I wonder where this has come from. And if you then go back 6 years, the American government passed a thing called the Jazz Preservation Act. And what this did was enshrine in almost like law this idea that jazz is a black music form. It expresses the horrors and experience of the Afro-American in music, and out of that has come this highly sophisticated music form which is like classical music and needs to be treated as such. I thought this was quite interesting because this act passed in America with unanimous agreement on both sides, on the right and the left. So this was a thing that everybody wanted to get behind and agree with. And of course, on the surface, it seems like the intentions between an act like that are fantastic, and an art form that I love, to have a law, that is there to preserve jazz, sounds great. But that word preserve is a strange word, isn't it? Have they just stuck jazz in some pickling jar? Is it that sort of preservation that we're talking about? Now, the Jazz Preservation Act actually came out of the National Endowment for the Arts, which is a public body which funds the arts. Now, let's back up. In 2001, Ken Burns brought out his documentary Jazz. It was the definitive history of jazz. This documentary cost millions and was funded by the National Endowment of the Arts. Okay? I watched that very excitedly, and I actually bought it on DVD, and I watched it repeatedly, and a lot of the knowledge I have on this channel came from that DVD. I loved it. I thought it was brilliant. The explanation of the origins of jazz, absolutely brilliant. I learned so much watching that film, but as I was watching it, there was a certain idea that I accepted at the time, which is the idea that this is a black music form, that white people have been involved in it, but it's almost like cultural appropriation, that, you know, that they were taking from the black artists. And of course, I'd read many history of jazzes up until that point, and that didn't quite ring true to me. It didn't quite ring true. What I felt was that before, that there was an art form called jazz. It had its roots in all sorts of things. It really had its roots in the American experience, and the Afro-American part of it was central, right? But all sorts of people had been involved in its creation, okay? In the 70s, and this is pre sort of this identity politics awareness age that we live in now, the thing you would read is that the first jazz group that was recorded was the original Dixieland Jazz Group, original Dixieland Jazz Band, sorry. This is groundbreaking stuff. This was a New Orleans band playing real jazz. But this idea comes out that now they were white musicians, and they'd appropriated that off the black musicians that lived in New York. And because of racism, they got recorded first because they were white. Now, I knew that that wasn't the case because the black trumpet player, the great black trumpet player, Freddie Kephard, before then, someone wanted to record him. He would have become the first jazz recording, and he didn't want to do it because he thought everyone would steal his style. Now, that goes against the narrative. And also, if you go back and you look at quotes from Louis Armstrong, in, I think around about 1936, is quoted as saying that the original Dixieland Jazz Group was a groundbreaking group. It was like almost like the orchestra of jazz, and they were pioneering and they were influential. And this is Louis Armstrong. Louis Armstrong is the greatest musician that's ever lived in the 20th century, you know. But we're going to ignore what Louis says there. All right? Now, where's this idea come from? Because this idea is in the jazz documentary by Ken Burns, right at the start, okay? Right at the start. Brilliant though it is, there's this idea going on that the contributions of other races, Jews, you know, white people, and of course back then, the Irish, the Italian Americans, were not on the same level of sort of European white people. They were seen as different. Creoles were seen as different. Creoles saw themselves, and many of the great artists that really created jazz were Creole. If we think of Jelly Roll Morton or Sidney Bechet. Sidney Bechet had come from a very middle-class family. Duke Ellington came from a middle-class family. It's much more complex than the idea of this sort of underprivileged class. Now, of course, Sidney Bechet would have experienced horrendous racism at that time, but it's more nuanced. He was a Creole. He would have seen himself as more educated and more erudite, and would have also been looking down at the black people, which is an awful thing. And this is one of the creators of jazz, but that was what it was like at that point. The thing that I thought was wonderful about jazz is that it was a music form where all these people could come together. And when you looked at the history of jazz, that you know, black and white and Creole and Native American were all actually working together in groups, but they couldn't do it publicly because of the horrible racism that was around at the time then. So this didn't seem to ring true, but I got to be honest, because this was such an important documentary, I just accepted that. I went, well, yeah, but mate, it is a black music form, and it is like the classical music, and it is this high music form, and I know It started off in brothels, and it started off in minstrelsy, and it started off by the impoverished, and it was party music and marching music. But that aspect you have to sort of put to the side, and what you have to do is focus on the fact that here is the roots of the great American classical music form. Even though you could say that like rhythm and blues, and then rock and roll, and then soul, and then heavy rock and heavy metal, and all those forms that came out of jazz came out of that other, more visceral, earthy form. But that is, we're going to sort of discount that, and we're going to try and focus on this highfalutin part of jazz. Now, to me, jazz does both. That's what's incredible about it. It opens its arms to the world. It opens its arms up to all the people in the world and creates all these music forms. Some of it's really popular and dancey, and some of it is really rarefied and intellectual. And there's sometimes with someone like with a master like Duke Ellington that can do both. It's an incredible thing. But as I said, I took the Ken Burns, documentary at face value. I accepted it, and I was looking forward to them finally, in the later episodes, getting to my heroes. But they never appeared. I was like, where are they? Where's Herbie Hancock? Where's John McLaughlin? Where's Keith Jarrett? Where's Keith Jarrett? He's like one of the most important musicians of the 20th century. Where's Pat Metheny? Where's Jaco Pastorius? But also, where's all the free jazz guys that I grew up listening to and loved? Where's Anthony Braxton? Where's Albert Ayler? Where's all the white European musicians like Peter Brotzmann? Where's like Hans Benink? Where's like Derek Bailey? Derek Bailey had written a book on improvisation, and here in the UK had made a documentary on improvisation that I'd seen before, and had not argued anything about sort of black art forms and classical music. It explored this idea of improvisation and improvisation having value, right? Now, the National Endowment of the Arts, which funded Ken Burns' documentary, this started in 1965. And in 1965, you were at a peak of expressive avant-garde art forms, and it was there to provide money to support art that couldn't be made any other way, right? This is forward-thinking, avant-garde, difficult art. By the time the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, got to the 80s, Ronald Reagan, being on the right and not wanting to really fund public art, was pulling funding, and they had to change their tune. And this idea that jazz, not the jazz fusion, not the free jazz, not any of that jazz, not the bits that turn into rhythm and blues and rock and roll and all that, not that, but the sort of pre-1970s jazz was perfect to fit the public idea of what should be funded, right? This is where the conservatism comes in. The jazz of the pre-70s could be performed in a concert. You could bring people in and put them into what looks like an orchestra. You could then train them up, so it had an educational side to it, and it would be championing a history which was felt to be underrepresented, which is the experience of the Afro-American. All these tick the boxes for funding, and the NEA then started to put money into that kind of jazz. They handed out grants to, I think, Roy Eldridge, Dizzy Gillespie and Sun Ra. Now, Sun Ra is one of the most important musicians of the 20th century, really important for jazz. He had kept together this big band, avant-garde big band jazz group, which is so important to the history of jazz. And he kept that in really impoverished conditions. All those brilliant musicians were working for virtually nothing because they loved Sun Ra's music. So this was really welcome. To be able to support someone like Sun Ra is really important. And I would say that is great. Dizzy Gillespie, I'm sure Dizzy Gillespie had a reasonable career. I don't know. But to be able to support these legends, I think is a fantastic thing. But a narrative starts to emerge, doesn't it? To get funded, to get the money, you've got to be seen as not just being jazz. You've got to be jazz which is Afro-American in origin, preferably with Afro-Americans playing it. You've got to have an educational aspect to it, which a big band is much better than a small group, but small groups you could do it, and we start to see the emergence of this whole sort of jazz education things that so many people have said has killed jazz. But there's another idea here as well. It's the idea of composition. Composition, this Western European idea that when you write something down, it's more valuable than when it's in the air, right? This idea emerges. Now, where does this come from? Because, of course, as this funding appears and they start to go down that direction, we see the emergence of the Young Lions. This was a group of musicians that didn't want to play jazz rock, they didn't want to play fusion, they didn't want to play free jazz, right? They wanted to play in an old-fashioned post-hard bop style. Now, the poster boy of that movement was, of course, Winton Marsalis. And Winton Marsalis was like a gift, because Winton had grown up in New Orleans. He wasn't from New York, he'd grown up in New Orleans, the birthplace of jazz, and was entrenched in that because he came from the Marsalis family, and the Marsalis family had its links to education. You know, Ellis Marsalis was one of the great jazz educators, so he'd been brought up in this educational environments within New Orleans. He was playing the old-fashioned styles of music, right? And he was very vocal and charismatic and articulate, right? So he signed a deal, right? And his first album comes out and it sells millions. Really weird for a jazz album. Now, the reason for this, because I can remember it at the time, is the newspapers and the media was all over Winton. And the reason was because he could also play classical music. He was that good. You know, he's that good. Now, Kenny Burrell, could he play classical music? Or, you know, what about Chet Baker? I don't think he could play classical music. I don't think Stan Getz could play classical. But Winton was so good, he could play classical music. This is a perfect storm. And Winton comes steaming in. And he starts to criticise musicians like Miles Davis, saying that his modern electric band, the 1980s electric band, which is utilising all sorts of styles and approaches from 80s popular music, from free jazz, from like the songbook, he's doing all sorts of things. He says he's playing nothing, there's nothing going on there. Miles sort of retorts with the famous comment, which was something like, who does Winton Marsalis think he is the saviour of jazz? There, Miles is really pointing at an emergence of an idea. Yes, he was the saviour of jazz. Jazz was about to be preserved and it was going to be a certain type of jazz. And that narrative is going to be pushed and people are going to accept that narrative about jazz across all others. So if you, let's say, look at the Hot Club of France, or you look at Dave Brubeck, or you look at Benny Goodman or Bix Beiderbecke, right, or you look at Jerry Mulligan, or you look at Peter Brotzmann, or you look at John McLaughlin, what music are they playing, right? Are they playing jazz? Well, they are, but it's not the same as the jazz which we are now ploughing money into. A couple of like orchestras were set up. I'm calling them big bands, they're orchestras, and there was Jazz at the Lincoln Centre, I think it's the name of Winton Marsalis. He becomes the director of that, and tons of money now floods in. All right, they fund the jazz documentary by Ken Burns, which becomes the definitive and is shown repeatedly on television. You know, you wait a year, it will be on some channel somewhere, usually public broadcasting. And in there you have Winton Marsalis and his mentor Stanley Crouch telling you what jazz is. This is propaganda, all right? It's without doubt propaganda. Okay, of course there's elements of truth in all of this, all the points they make about, you know, yes, African Americans played a central part, yes, it's rooted in the suffering, yes, there's like a democratic part of jazz and it's a gift, right? But what I find much more interesting about the Afro-American aspect of jazz is that so many of the absolute geniuses of this style, not all of them, but so many of them, are Afro-American. I'm not going to use the word black because I don't think black's got anything to do with it. I don't. Now, as soon as I say something like that, I know there's so many people saying, how can this guy say, he's a white English middle class person, how can he say this? He hasn't got a right to say it. Because jazz is an Afro-American form and he is not Afro-American, so you just can't comment on it. Those are specifically the ideas that emerge. That's the propaganda. Is that the case? Is it the case that you are not allowed to talk about something unless you are of that racial background that has been associated with that thing? That to me sounds like sort of fascism or totalitarian authoritism. It's awful, right? And it's those aspects. Now, of course, once you've got this high form of music that's like opera or classical music, and you put on these concerts that have been funded by the National Endowment of the Arts in these big not jazz clubs, but in these big sort of concert halls, who starts to turn up? The educated, privileged elite. Okay? The fees to go to jazz college go through the roof. So the only people that can really afford to now study jazz are the rich, educated elite. And they can then have a career in jazz because when they leave college, they can fund it. They haven't got to live off the profits. And I have seen this. This is an absolute fact. And this is wider. So many musicians now working in the industry have been able to fund themselves. And I get tired of looking at sort of big artists in the music industry and then tracking it back and finding out their parents are millionaires and or they had contacts with the industry. This is this idea of the plant, you know. So what we have here is jazz has now become this funded thing, a certain type of jazz which is a highfalutin, you know, equal to classical music, virtuoso, with all the richness and wonder of sort of post-bebop jazz where you have to play through the changes and you have to have this sort of virtuoso thing. It's not so much about self-expression. And what's really interesting is at this point when Winton Marsalis takes over jazz at the Lincoln Center and he becomes the director of it, he starts to make statements that someone like Duke Ellington is greater than Charlie Parker. There's a quote where he really explains why he thinks Duke is greater. And the reason why he thinks that Duke is greater is because Duke was a composer and was making compositions, whereas Charlie Parker was just an incredible improviser and his stuff goes out into the air. Now, for me, that thing about being in the moment, this is what is great about jazz. I don't think Duke Ellington was a genius and the input in terms of composition is so important, but the in the moment, in the now, swinging and grooving, that's really what jazz is about. That's a really interesting statement that Winton Marsalis makes. And so I think the patronage has moved from people on the streets to an elite. Who's this calling? Oh, I've got to take this call, haven't I? So, that's the end of the video. That's what I want to talk about. I'm sorry I had that little phone call come through. I wanted to be really serious. It wasn't my mum this time. It wasn't my mum. It's actually a meeting that I'm supposed to be in and I've missed. Because this is an important subject. So anyway, that is the conclusions I've come up with. I have done some research on this and I've tried to get my facts straight. I'm apologise if I don't. You know what my videos are like. And this is the problem with my videos. Normally it comes in, it's my opinion, I just spout what I'm thinking and that there's that. I don't do the research, that's part of the sort of charm. It's about being like jazz, it's in the moment. With this I have gone and done a lot of reading and I hope I got my facts straight. I'm sure if I haven't, people will correct me. But I think that is fundamentally the thing I'm picking up on. My conclusion of all this is that jazz has moved from being this visceral, alive, in the moment music forms that are made by people that aren't in the education system. They're out there forging new ways of doing stuff and new approaches to music, and they're on the edge of society. They're like it's outsiders, which is what Afro-Americans were, and this music personifies that. And I think that it's moved from that, it is now the elite. And so when someone stands up who's gone through music college, that has come from this privileged background, and they're trying to play like Wayne Shorter, or even if they're trying to play like Anthony Braxton or Ornette Coleman, there's a difference, and that is what you pick up. It has become the music of the conservative mainstream elite, as so many things have now. And that's what I'm hearing. And I just wanted to truly, you know, after all this journey we've been on with all these videos, I just wanted to say that I think that's what I'm picking up on. Anyway, if you like this video, like it. And if you want to see more, subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you want to support me on Patreon, you can. And there's a big essay on Patreon which goes into much more detail about this history that I wrote as part of my research for this video, plus a whole ton of other stuff. And if you don't want to go to Patreon, I have a tip jar down there, my PayPal tip jar, and you can stick a few pence in, and that really helps me in doing these videos. People are trying to get hold of me. I'm a very busy man, you know, I've got all sorts of messages going on, so I better go, you know. I'm not just here to make videos for you. I've got to do other stuff. Life goes on. Life goes on in the here and now, and that's what jazz is. It's all about the here and the now, not the preservation of stuff that happened a long time ago to other people that are now all dead.